The first lab for this semester isn't really a lab at all. It's a dry lab, if you like, meant to exercise and get us ready for doing error analysis in all the other labs. And we're going to look at three different areas of error analysis. The first one's the simplest. You take a bunch of measurements and they're not all the same, so there's some error obviously in those measurements. And how do you get a measure of how reliable your overall measurement is given what you've measured? So let's consider an abstract case here. We've got 5 measurements, weights in grams, let's say, just to pick something specific. 5.2, 5.3, 4.9, 5.4, 5.2, 5 numbers, n equals 5. What am I doing when I'm measuring those numbers? Well, you can understand it as saying that each one of these numbers has a distribution of errors all of its own. And when you measure these numbers, you're sampling from this distribution. You're testing numbers in the distribution. You're more likely to get things that are high and near the peak of the distribution, but you can also get stuff that's out on the tail. So what you really want is to know what that distribution is. That tells you what all the errors are like. It's the most complete information you could have. But in order to do that in a practical way, in an actual experiment, the way to go about it is to make a histogram. That is, you make a whole bunch of measurements and then you bar up how many times you got each value of the measurement. And that's fine. That's great. That's the ideal thing to do in principle, but it takes a fair number of measurements. Usually we don't have 50 measurements, and really to get a good histogram you probably need hundreds of measurements. If you want a really good one, you probably need thousands of measurements. So it works for some kinds of data. If you're collecting a pile of data with an instrument, for example, automatically being reported on a computer or something, then you can do that. But most of the time you only got a few numbers. And in all the labs that we do for this semester, for example, we're only going to have a few numbers. So what can you do? Well, you don't know what that distribution is, but you can assume something about it. You can assume a shape for the distribution, and maybe that shape isn't exactly right, but that's okay. We can live with some uncertainty. And the most common shape is a Gaussian. It's a curve that looks like this, a bell curve. Here's the function that represents it, the mathematical function that represents it. It only has 2 parameters. It has the standard deviation and the mean of the measurements that you're making. So if you make 5 measurements and those are good enough to estimate the standard deviation and the mean, then you can get an estimate for what the entire distribution looks like in principle, at least. Now the estimate will have error, and you're making an assumption, right? You're assuming this mathematical form, but all that seems reasonable and a good way to proceed, and it lets you go a long ways on a little bit of data. So how do we go about that? Well, the traditional way, as I think probably everybody knows, is you use an estimator. The 2 most common estimators are the average, which is just the arithmetic average. Just add up all the numbers and divide by however many numbers you have. Or the standard deviation, which probably everybody here has used, probably multiple times, which you can calculate using this formula. So that you take the difference. Let me see. I should have put an I on there. The difference from the mean, from the calculated arithmetic average and of every point, every data point, and you square that, and then you divide that by n minus 1. And that turns out to be the same as averaging the square of all the data and then subtracting the square of the average. Both of those are equivalent formulas. Whichever one you use is whatever's most convenient. And that gives you an estimator of what the standard deviation is. But what I say here is that these are not the actual true mean of your true distribution or the true standard deviation. These guys are random numbers in their own right. If you do a bunch of different experiments, you're going to get a different answer from these guys every time, slightly different answer anyway. And that means they have their own distributions. What is that distribution? Well, it's something called the student's t distribution. Here's the mathematical form. And I don't know whether it's obvious to everybody out there or not, but that form is very much like a Gaussian. If you let n get large, n bigger than around 20 or so, it becomes very close to a Gaussian. You can look it up on Wikipedia, students' t-distribution, and find out more about it. But it's very close to a distribution, to a Gaussian distribution. It's just not quite exactly a Gaussian distribution. Anyway, if you do that, what you really want, or the really proper and rigorous thing that you want, is you want to know when you calculate that arithmetic average or that estimate of the standard deviation, you want to know how wide the interval is in order to be 95% sure that your true answer is somewhere inside that interval, and that's called a confidence interval. And so if this is the standard, if the student's t-distribution, then the 95% confidence interval is one that doesn't go all the way out here to the far end of the wings, because that goes to infinity, but goes reasonably far out. The only thing left out here in the wings are little bits of the distribution. You're almost certain that the true answer is somewhere within close to your estimated answer. The usual way to write that is that the confidence interval for the true mean is some constant which depends on the type of distribution. There's a set of tables for the student's t-distribution, for example, times the standard deviation as calculated, the estimator standard deviation, divided by the square root of n. Don't ask me where that formula comes from. I can derive it for you if you like, but it's a mess. And so we write that the true mean is our estimator for the mean, the arithmetic average, plus or minus this confidence interval calculation. But that's the real proper thing. You'll see that mostly in like psychology journals and stuff. The physical scientists, for some reason or other, don't use this much. They don't really need it that much. The psychologists really need it because they're dealing with much more noise than experimental scientists usually are, or physical scientists usually are. So usually what you'll see reported in the literature is just the mean plus or minus the standard deviation. Occasionally you'll see this too, but it's pretty rare now. All right, so for this lab, there's a bunch of exercises. There's 5 of them altogether. Let's talk a little bit about what those exercises are about. The very first one is very simple. It's just calculate statistics on a small data set. Here's my Excel sheet, or a picture of my Excel sheet when I did this experiment. Here is the data set itself. Here are all the statistical quantities. I got those using Excel with standard functions for Excel. So there's something called count, there's something called mean. They're actually called, I think, these names in each and every case. And so I won't say too much more about this. I don't think people are going to have any trouble. Just calculate all those numbers with Excel, or you can calculate them by hand for that matter. They're pretty easy. All right, so that's exercise 1, and the topic number 1. Topic number 2 is regression. Regression means that you're measuring one variable, so concentration here, versus another one, concentration versus time in this case. So for example, in I think it's lab 4, lab 5, I can't remember exactly which lab it is, but there's a kinetics experiment that we're going to do somewhere in the middle of the semester where you do measure concentration versus time. And you're going to get noise in your data, but you're going to want to interpret that data, and to do that you're going to use a model, a kinetic model, and that kinetic model will give you what amounts to a fitting function. A fitting function is something that's supposed to go through the data where you have some physical reason to believe that that function actually represents the data, but those fitting functions always have adjustable parameters, fit parameters. So in this case there's 2 of them, this quantity A, the prefactor, and then the quantity K, which basically controls how fast the rise is. And you want to know, how do I adjust these fit parameters in order to get the best possible and most justified values from the data? So in this case, I'm using the data basically as a way to extract fit parameters for my model. And after I do that, I'm going to claim in my paper that I write up for the literature that I've measured in some sense the rate constant for this kinetic process, K, and I haven't really measured it. What I've measured is concentration versus time, and then fit it to a fitting function, and that's my quote-unquote measurement. But that's what you see in the literature all the time. All right. The most common way to decide whether or not you've got a good fit or not is the least squares method. The idea is you've got a bunch of noise. Here's the data points. And you take the difference between the value of the fitting function and the value of the actual data at each and every time, and then you square that value, and then you add up all those values. And what that means is that if your fitting function, if your curve goes right through the data, you'll get a good fit. You get a small, what's called residual. These little differences will be as small as you can make them. But if you choose bad parameters, then you'll get great big residuals. And so the least squares measure, as it's called, is a good way to decide whether you've got a good fit or not. All right. The most common case is linear least squares. That's where you've got some physical reason to believe that your data should fall in a straight line. It has two parameters, the slope and the intercept. I think this is very familiar to everybody. The only thing that's maybe less familiar with a linear least squares fit is that there's a number of measures of how much error you have in your fit. One of them is called the mean square error. That's just the sum, basically, of the differences, the squared differences from your line and all the data. The bigger that number is, the less good your fit is, the smaller it is, the better it is. It's a measure of the goodness of fit overall for the entire line. Then there's the mean square error. Basically, the square root of that would be the standard deviation for the quantities that you're extracting, for the fitting parameters themselves. After all, they're random parameters too, right? There's error in them too. If you did a different set of data, you'd get a different value for M, and so there's fluctuations or variations or statistical noise, if you like, in the values of M and B, the slope and the intercept, as well. And so you can estimate a standard deviation for those. That's given by this formula. We won't go through it. And also for the intercept, that's given by this formula. So you can get estimates of how much noise there is in your estimate for the slope and the mean, slope and the intercept. And then finally, there's this goodness of fit called the coefficient of determination, or R squared parameter. I think probably most of you have seen this before. It ranges from 0 to 1, and 0 is a bad value. Close to 1 is a good value. For sort of social science data, the fits are often pretty terrible. An R squared value of 0.6 or something is often, or even lower, 0.2 is often obtained. That amounts to basically a cloud of data where the line is almost meaningless. For scientific data, if your R squared is even 0.9, that's pretty bad data. Physical sciences, R squareds are often 0.99 or 0.98 or something like that. So very high values of R squared are expected because the data are, of course, much less noisy. Here's my Excel chart from this part. I think this is exercise 2, though I didn't say that here. Here's my Excel chart from that. Here's the data. This is from the write-up for Lab 1, the instructions for Lab 1. You can see there's just 2 columns of data that I just typed in by hand. Those columns are designated in this Excel function called linest by their ranges in the normal Excel format. So the green stuff here is the column of values. The red ones here is the column of independent variables, dependent variables, and independent variables. And then you just run linest. Linest, though, has an output that will give you just a single number. You don't want that. You want it to give you all the values, all the metrics and statistical values that it can put out. And that's a whole array of values. Here they all are. But in order to get that whole array to print out, you need to do something called an array enter. So when you're doing all this, a little box will light up on the Excel sheet, and you need to array enter to show where you want Excel to put the answer, and to put a whole bunch of answers, not just one. And so the array enter trick is to Control Shift Enter, and if you forget that, like I always do, that's all right. You can come back and look at these notes and get it. All right, there is also, and there will be need frequently throughout the semester for nonlinear least squares fits. And there's an Excel function for that too. It's called solver. But solver isn't normally there. If you go to your Excel app or program, you won't see this little solver icon that is showing up on mine. The way you get that is you go to Tools. So where's Tools? Tools is not showing up on this picture. Anyway, there is a Tools somewhere on here. You go to Tools. I think it's in the upper bar here that I didn't show. And then you go to Excel add-ins, because solver is an add-in. And then you'll get a display with a bunch of possible add-ins. And you just check box the one for solver, and then after that, solver shows up on your desktop, so no problem. All right, solver is a little complicated to use, and we won't need it for a while, so I won't go through it in detail here, but if you want, you can peruse this example that I did. This is actually an example that was done very similar to what we will be doing in that kinetics experiment that I mentioned earlier. And I will talk a little bit about what these columns are. Don't worry if you don't understand what this is all about. But these first 3 columns here, in fact, are just me setting up some fake data so that I can fit it. So I'm setting up some artificially noisy data. And to do that, I do this calculation with this noise-free function, and then I add some noise to it. And that's what's in this column C right here. So that's the fake data that's in column C. The other columns are just useful for setting up column C. And then I set up a fitting function, which is exactly the one I used above, that's got 2 parameters that can be adjusted. And there's a way to tell the solver routine. When you push this button up here, you'll get a window out that has a bunch of stuff in it, and it's, without going through it, it's kind of hard to describe how that works, but you can try it and see for yourself. Play around till you get it to work, till you figure it out. And solver needs a fitting function, and that's what I have here. That's what's in this column, and then it needs a way to measure how close the fitting function is to the actual data. And so what this column is here, it's actually shown up here. It's this business right here. E16 is this column. That's the fit function. I subtract D16, which is in this column, and then I square it. And so this is all the squared differences between the fit and the true data, or fake data, really. And then down here is the sum of all those squares. That's the actual goodness of fit measure that solver is going to use. That's one of the inputs. This box here is one of the inputs that solver is going to want. Then solver is also going to want the parameters some initial parameters. Solver will change these parameters as it's going through its business, but it needs some initial guess, so you got to tell it those 2 boxes as well. So that's A and K obviously here. And then you'll see solver run, and you'll see all these numbers changing as solver runs. And hopefully, solver is not infallible. It can give you crappy answers if you don't set things up right, and if you don't give it some reasonable guesses as initial answers, initial values. You'll see all these numbers changing, and if everything is set up right, you'll get good numbers. So, for example, in this case, the fake data function that I put in has a 5 here and a 1.2 there. Here's my fitting function. You can see the function is right. All I got to do is get the right numbers for A and K, and the right numbers according to what I put in, it should be 5 and 1.2. And indeed, you can see solver isn't perfect because the noise is confusing it a little bit, but it's pretty close. 5.04, 5.05, and 1.18 is very close to 5 and 1.2. All right, last topic, I think, yes, that's right, is propagation of errors. So propagation of errors has to do with the issue of when you make some measurements and then you calculate something else with those values. So the values you measure, of course, have error associated with them. Now you make a calculation. What's the error in that calculated value? Propagation of errors tells you that. So let's consider a concrete special case. One of the experiments this semester is an STM experiment. We're going to measure, we're going to take pictures, atomic resolution pictures of graphite, and try to measure lattice parameters for graphite. So let's suppose that graphite looks like this. I deliberately distorted it. Graphite doesn't actually look like this. It's got good hexagons, not these flattened ones. But I wanted something that wasn't quite as symmetric for the purposes of this experiment, or this example. So let's suppose this is what graphite looks like. Here's a point, here's a point, here's a point, here's a point, all in separate unit cells. And so that parallelogram there is a primitive unit cell for the lattice. We want to know what the area inside that unit cell is. And to do that, we're going to measure this length and this angle, and you can do all that with the STM software. If you get a good image, a good atomic resolution image, you can measure all those lattice parameters. If you have those values, then the area is A times B times sine theta. So that's our function, that's our calculation, and these are our measured values. So when we measure A, when we measure B, when we measure theta, there's going to be some error. There's going to be a mean value in every case. There's going to be a standard deviation in every case. This delta A means standard deviation. So it's really the square root of the mean of delta A squared. That's what this delta A is. And we want to know if we have these errors in our base measurements, what's the error in A? Well, it turns out you can show, if you look back at the notes, I didn't say anything about that up at the top here, but let me say something, that there's a more complete set of notes that has details that I'm leaving out in this talk, called Lab 1 Notes on Error Analysis. And so I encourage people to go look at those notes if you have any questions especially, but also to look at them because there's more information than in this talk. So going back down, you can show, and it's shown in those notes, that in general, if you have some function, this is your calculation, that depends on one or more parameters, one or more inputs that you've measured and have errors, then the error in the calculated value, delta F here, that is the standard deviation of the, this should have a square root on it. Let me do that right. There we go. Then the standard deviation, or the error in the calculated value, is given by this formula. You take the partial derivative of your calculation with respect to one of the values, square it, multiply it by the standard deviation for one of your measured values, square that, right? So it's really the variance. It's the square of the standard deviation. Do the same thing for the other two values, or however many there are, and take the square root of everything, and that gives you the error in the calculated value. So let's continue with the concrete example up above. Our function in this case is A, and it's given by AB sine theta. The partial derivatives of A are B sine theta, A sine theta, and AB cosine theta. Plugging in, we get that the error in the area will then be partial derivative, right, B sine theta squared times error in A, delta A squared, and so on for B and for theta. Let's pick some particular values. Let's suppose the length of side A is the average length, right, without error, ignoring the error for now. It's 3.0 angstroms. For B, it's 2.0 angstroms. And for theta, it's 60 degrees. But the error is 0.2 angstroms in A, 0.2 angstroms in B, and about 5 degrees, which is 0.044 radians. Notice you have to use radians here for the angle. That means that the nominal average or mean value for the area is putting all the mean values into our formula above. That gives you 5.20 angstroms squared for our nominal area. But the error in that area is given by plugging all the numbers into this formula up here, and that's what all these are, and that gives you about half an angstrom squared for the error given the numbers that I put up above, so about 10% error compared to the nominal true value. All right. Exercises 3, 4, and 5 in the write-up are all exercises in this particular type of thing. It's kind of the most complicated mathematically, so there's 3 exercises in it instead of just 1. If anybody has any questions, please email me and I'll do my best to answer them.